Well, a lot of people ask me, how many times have you smoked DMT? And they, figure hundreds and hundreds. One.
One. Wow. I'm curious to know your perspective on these, what people call autonomous DMT entities. Dr. Rick Strassman is a pioneering psychiatrist, author, and psychedelic researcher that kickstarted the psychedelic renaissance after a 20-year hiatus with his groundbreaking study on DMT. Pre-order his upcoming book, My Altered States, link in the description, and check out our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Feel free to leave a nice review. For 8 years, YouTube has constantly been demonetizing our educational content, so your continued support on Patreon is vital for our work. Consider becoming a patron and get access to exclusive content for just $5 a month. Thank you, appreciate you, much love.
I was talking with a friend this morning, and I, told her I was going to be on your show, and she was listening to your show a couple of years ago when things were a little bit going south. It sounded like,
Oh yeah, yep.
yeah, yeah. And I said, well, he seems pretty straight shooter to me.
What did she say? Like I was losing my mind, or?
A lot of weed, a lot of everything. Yeah.
Yep, true, true. I actually just finally ended my relationship with cannabis after going a bit too far with it. So
Hmm. Yeah, one can go too far with cannabis.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Have you
especially
had
with
experience
this.
with this?
Well, I've been smoking cannabis since I was 17 or 18. Um, I've never gotten into big trouble with it. Like if I use it like every day, I start kind of losing my edge, and
Mm,
I get a little depressed. And then when I stop, my sleep's disturbed for maybe a week or so. But never like psychotic on it or completely down in the gutter with it.
yes. I went because I started when I was like about 12, so I'm sure that had a more significant negative impact because my brain was still developing. 17 too, but I just went a bit too far. I felt too much in love with it, you could say.
Yeah. Well, in my marriage, it was a threesome. It was me, her, and cannabis.
Yeah. I relate with that.
And every time we stopped smoking, she would call a lawyer. It was the damnedest thing. And then finally, like we were living in a little town with a small post office. We were getting our pot mailed up to us. And I just said, I can't do this. Like I'm a physician in a little town and a little post office, and we're getting pot sent up to us. I can't do it. So, that was the end of the marriage.
Uh, so gotta be responsible.
Yeah, yeah, it's a sad story, but yeah, it's interesting. Well, especially with how strong pot is now.
Oh, absolutely. And because I went to Thailand not too long ago and I'm looking at the dispensaries and they're just trying to get the percentage of THC through the roof and everyone's coming in like 35%, 40%. I'm like, man, this is
Oh,
crazy.
really? Oh,
Yeah.
so up to 35 and 40%.
Yeah. And people, dabbing and rolling it with crystal, just really taking it to a level that's like, wow, that's
Yeah,
okay. Fair enough,
yeah, yeah,
but a bit too much
yeah,
for
yeah,
me.
yeah. That's drug abuse.
Yeah, 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 exactly at that point. So, first, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I'm actually a huge fan of your work. I read The Spirit Molecule around 12 years ago, and this kind of influenced my trajectory into getting into ayahuasca, going to the Amazon, which influenced me to start this channel. So, I want to thank you for that because I know that this spirit molecule, I think, like we talked about a few weeks ago, it's taken a life of its own.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my publisher called it an instant classic, which all publishers, like, to have on their hands. So, yeah, yeah, well, I think one of the things that really helped it was an Art Bell interview. Do you remember Coast to Coast with Art Bell?
No, what's that?
It was a huge podcast, like huge,
Oh, okay.
like midnight in Las Vegas, and he'd start at midnight. Yeah, and it was like UFOs and Terrence McKenna and all kinds of you know, fairly edgy stuff. And I was on his show like almost immediately after the book came out in 2001, and it was a pretty good interview. Yeah, yes, that helped. And Whitley Strieber, the guy that wrote Communion, he was abducted, and he had like a big abduction experience. Yeah, and his podcast back then was quite popular too. So I think some good podcasts really help.
Wow. Yeah, it was it just even like with the documentary that was made and Joe Rogan doing the intro, like that was huge as well. Um,
Yeah, yeah, a lot of
yeah,
people got introduced to my work through that documentary.
and I would love to ask you because since that book and the research was done a few decades ago now, has there been any emerging studies on DMT or the pineal gland that has kind of caught your attention?
Well, compared to psilocybin and LSD and MDMA, yeah, DMT is still kind of a niche, drug both commercially and academically. Um, there are a handful of developments. I could dispense with it commercial applications, which are pretty slow right now. I think there's a group or a drug company in London, in England, that's looking at using DMT for depression, and they're working on new formulations. Um, I think in particular, like a lozenge that you stick up against your cheek and it gets absorbed, buccally. The main problem with injecting DMT or smoking it is the onset is just very fast. It can be quite disorienting, and it's over before you know it. It's over in 15, 20 minutes. So if you can extend the state and slow down the onset a bit, you could do more therapeutic, work with DMT. I think that people have um, been looking at the longer acting, drugs because you can do psychotherapy, when you're intoxicated, which you really can't with a full dose of DMT. So I think there's one commercial company, looking at it as a antidepressant. I'm consulting with a group uh, in Canada called Algernon, which is you're looking at a continuous infusion of DMT over 6 hours, sub psychedelic dose. You barely know you're getting anything, in
Hmm.
anticipation of you're getting a stroke rehabilitation study off the ground. They're still studying normal volunteers, to work out the bugs. And that study or that approach is intended to exploit the neuroplasticity and neurogenesis effects of DMT. So academically, there's interest in DMT as a stimulant of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, increasing the number of connections between neurons and the growth of new neurons from stem cells. Um, there's a 2019 paper came out of Michigan, demonstrating quite high levels of DMT in the rodent brain, in the cortex. So everybody was
Hmm.
always thinking that DMT was made in the lungs. But if you really look carefully, it's not made in the lungs. But it's made in the brain, and the concentrations are quite high. Comparable to traditional neurotransmitters. So that opens up the possibility of DMT being a neurotransmitter, which is going to really like takes it's going to lead down some very interesting rabbit holes, like what is endogenous DMT doing in the mammalian brain, and especially what's a DMT neurotransmitter system doing in the brain. um, there's one study that came out of Yale a few years ago using a single injection of DMT as an antidepressant, without any therapy, and it was helpful. So the whole question of do you need therapy, what kind, et cetera, is still an open question. You mentioned the continuous infusion, which they're doing up in Canada, or the company in Canada is doing. There's a couple of groups, one in London, one in Bern, Switzerland, no, Basel, Switzerland, where they're giving you full doses of DMT as a continuous infusion. The London group 30 to 60 minutes, the Basel group 90 minutes, so it's a full on DMT experience. And they're only doing that with normal volunteers, working out the infusion rates and concentrations and things. But one of the goals of that kind of work is to clarify the DMT state better, because it is over so fast. You get oriented after the initial rush,
Mm.
so if you have a longer time to kind of linger in that state, uh, you can learn more about it, interact with it, more, fulsomely. Um, yeah, so compared, to, to longer acting drugs, DMT is still not quite ready, for prime time.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to do with the experience. Like I can speak from personal experience. I've had a few of these DMT trips, and while it feels profound in the moment, you come back and you're like, okay, it's kind of blurry puzzle pieces everywhere. You're trying to put things together. It's hard to really marinate in that experience.
Yeah, I think so. People can uh, describe the state in great detail,
Yes.
the colors and the shapes and the feelings and the movement and all that stuff. But what does it mean? And unless you're able to kind of interact with it, give and take, ask questions, just kind of see where it goes. The meaning just kind of passes over you.
Yeah, so to go back on this endogenous DMT and how it, do you still believe that it produced by the pineal gland?
Well, I put that pineal gland, location of DMT synthesis together in the late 80s, early 90s. Uh, and it was, a sound hypothesis.
Mm,
I marshal all of, the evidence of, the precursors, the ingredients being in the pineal and the enzymes that convert the precursors into DMT being in the pineal. There's more concentration of serotonin in the pineal than any organ in the body. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that the pineal may make DMT. There was a 2013 study from the same Michigan group, which demonstrated dialysate levels, measurable dialysate levels of DMT in the rodent pineal, which means they stuck a probe in, sampled some of the fluid in and around the pineal, pulled out the probe, and they found, DMT. So that was in 2013, and it, established, that at least the fluid or around the pineal contained DMT. They went back and repeated that study in their 2019 paper, and they didn't really find DMT in the pineal. And they concluded that their earlier data resulted from snagging your brain tissue
mm.
in and out of the animal in the original 2013 paper. But still, the precursors are in the pineal, the enzymes are in the pineal. So I think even though that 2019 data might add some skepticism, I don't think it was the death knell. People without pineal glands live normal lives. They dream, they're creative, they think.
Mm.
Like if you've had a stroke of the pineal or pineal destroying cyst, those kinds of things. You have more problems with jet lag. That's seems to be the main problem. Otherwise, everything seems to be working okay. And the pineal gland, it would have been icing on the cake. But I'm not especially wedded to the idea. It's cool, but I think the fact that the brain makes these really high concentrations of DMT is even more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. In your upcoming book, My Altered States, I'll leave a link for the pre-order in the description for those listening. You talked about your first fully psychedelic experience in the Tibetan prayer wheel room. And I'm wondering, is it possible to enter these DMT states through meditation alone, or is this a distinct experience to, let's say, smoking DMT?
Yeah, well, you're describing a chapter in that new book. That occurred when I was 22, um, and I was spending the summer, doing an elective, for medical school, in a Tibetan Buddhist, study center in Berkeley. And one of our assignments was to sit in the wheel in this small room with a huge prayer wheel, like 7 feet tall, multiple tons, like 3
Wow.
feet across, just spinning, 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 spinning. And you're supposed to spend a couple hours down there, meditating, working on the practices that the Lama gave us, for the weekend. Yeah, and I was, thinking I would, work on stuff like my stammer and my, sexual problems and things. Yeah, so instead, it's like this world of, craziness, just opened up in front of me as I, bore into the meditation using, the extra power of the sound and the vibration and the wind and things. Yeah, and I just, you know, I had a full on psychedelic vision of being abused, being molested, being an infant on the bassinet, and my mom in the corner. Yeah, it was completely unexpected and very intense, and I had almost no control over it. So that chapter was a springboard for discussing the role of naturally occurring DMT in non-drug altered states. Like if you're schizophrenic, does that mean you're producing more DMT? You're hearing things and you're seeing things.
Mm,
Yeah, so we don't know what turns on DMT, what turns it off, naturally, the production. John Dean at UC San Diego is working on a means of visualizing DMT synthesis in the living human using FR, using functional magnetic spectroscopy. And
mm,
it's a painstaking process, just like very, very, very slow. But he's young and he's energetic and he really wants to figure this out. So in the next few years, we may be able to look at the production of naturally occurring DMT. In which case, we could start correlating it with other altered states like sleep, dreams, psychosis, near death, meditation experiences, and things like that.
mm. Yeah, it's fascinating. Because I've had some my own meditation experiences of kind of and lucid dreaming and other non-psychedelic drug states, but nothing that brought me to that DMT tryptamine kind of space. But I'm sure it's possible for so I've heard people through deep breath meditation or Kundalini yoga have had some pretty spectacular experiences.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's just the time and the place. Like I did
Mm,
some breath work a long time ago, early '90s, late '80s. Yeah, and once I broke through, it was quite psychedelic. It wasn't like a tryptamine psychedelic, more like an MDMA experience. But I was
mm.
really altered, and it was it was just in the blink of an eye it happened. Those are my only two experiences of super altered states, without some exogenous substance.
Yeah. So what, for those who maybe aren't too familiar, what happens to the brain when you smoke DMT?
Um, well, DMT is a classical psychedelic, like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline. It stimulates certain subtypes of serotonin receptors, called the 2A receptor. Um, And as a result of those receptors being stimulated, there's this whole cascade of changes in the connectivity of various brain centers. The the two most important are what's called the default mode network, which is a complex of various brain centers, which are distributed throughout the brain, and they're responsible for lack of a better concept, one's sense of self, your habits and your beliefs and your repetitive behaviors and sense of your personality and things, your likes and dislikes. Um, so that's one thing. The connections within that network become looser. The connections are no longer as strong, which if you would translate that into subjective experience, it would mean like a loosening of your sense of self. You're more receptive to new ideas, new perceptions, new feelings. The other marked feature of network connectivity is that the connections from the default mode network down to the lower centers like emotion and memory and things. um, the downward control of those lower centers becomes loosened, and the upward movement of information from those lower centers strengthens. So that could explain or help us understand the biology mediating recalling forgotten memories, making new associations, feeling things in a way that you'd never had felt them before. So in a way, it's just simply confirming what introspection reveals, which is you're kind of more open to things, and stuff bubbles up from your unconscious.
Mm. And an
It,
interesting phenomenon I've realized is you have that a lot of people have that feeling of I've been here before. That I found very strange.
right. I know. I've been here before. Plus, this is more real than everyday reality.
Yes.
And both of those are very interesting findings. Like, is there a center in your brain which regulates reality? And if so, or your sense of reality anyway. And if so, what regulates that? um, you know are there bursts of DMT occurring naturally that imprint certain experiences or ideas in your mind that are now important when they weren't before? um, yeah, and the familiarity, I think, relates to that feeling of enhanced reality.
Yeah, and it's strange because it's not that hard for humans to get into these altered states, even without using external substances. I mean, just go in a dark room for a while and your mind will start playing tricks on you, or these hallucination experiments like the Ganzil effect or whatever it's called,
Hmm. Right.
where you put the ping pong balls or yeah, so
Gansfield, I think, is called.
Yeah, Ganzfeld, that's right. I haven't personally tried it, but I've been looking at some videos on it. Or the strobe light effect, just from blinking lights can make you have some visual distortions. So
Hmm.
there's definitely something in the brain that I don't know. We're obviously still exploring this and what it means, but it's very fascinating.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be like an inborn drive to experience altered states, and the mechanism to incur or produce altered states is built in. So there is some advantage, some function of entering into altered states. Whether that's evolutionary or spiritual, is hard to say right now.
Yeah, all the above. Who
Or all
knows?
the above. Right.
Yeah,
Well, purely biologically, evolutionarily valuable, or spiritually evolutionarily valuable, and the two don't necessarily overlap entirely.
true. Do you think there is any evolutionary purpose for DMT and why it's found throughout nature and why the human brain potentially produces it and why we even go into these altered states? Like, what do you think the purpose of this is?
Yeah. Well, a few years ago, Andrew Newberg, who was then at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a book called Neurotheology. And it explains, or it's it's a model, for understanding altered states, especially those which occur naturally, like, from prayer, from meditation, NDEs, things like that.
Hmm.
Um, so his theory is, that if you experience these states, it confers an evolutionary advantage. You might be more creative, you might be more social, you might be more compassionate. Um, your vision may improve. You might increase your problem solving your capabilities. So there's an evolutionary advantage either, to the individual and, to the larger species. That's what I guess you would call a bottom-up model. That if you experience, God on drugs, it's the impression of God on drugs.
Mm.
And I developed a model a few years back in my book DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, which came out in 2014. And I, kind of, turn that model on its head and, develop one called theoneurology, which is a top-down model, which postulates, and this is much more difficult to prove, obviously. It postulates, that we have spontaneous or non, drug induced altered states as a means of communicating with the divine. The divine, from above,
Mm.
downloads imagery, which contains information, from above in these images, in the visions and the voices. And it is God speaking with us, as opposed to the impression of God speaking with us. So that's a different model.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'd love to get actually deeper into that, perhaps in the next our next interview into the Judaism and these mystical states and the potential meaning of these symbolic stories.
Yeah, I think that one of the shortcomings of the approach to psychedelic states right now, and it's mostly coming from research uh, centers, is prioritizing these unitive mystical experiences. It's ecstatic, all is one, no time, no space, no personality, no content. And the goal is to feel better, is to
Mm.
help your depression, is to help your substance abuse, to be more creative, to become more open, those kinds of things. But as a result of emphasizing those kinds of states, you're ignoring or relegating to a lower level interactive relational states, which are ones which are like DMT. They're full of content. Your
Hmm.
personality is maintained. You interact. There's a ton of information, and it's quite specific. It's often verbal, telepathically, communicated. So people have more, trouble, with discrete cognitive message, as opposed to it's all one. You could, lay whatever you want on the all is one experience after you come down, and you can say, oh, this means I ought to go to medical school, or this means I ought to start a research foundation, or this means I ought to divorce my wife, or any number of things. But it's after the fact, and you just kind of make it up on the fly in a lot of ways. But when you have an interactive relational state, and this thing is telling you get a divorce, or go to medical school, or well,
Mm.
Abram Hoffer was a psychiatrist up in Canada, and he was interviewed for a BBC documentary a long time ago, almost 30 years ago. I was on that. I'm on that episode, and Hoffer spoke about one of his alcoholic patients up in Canada, and like he gave this guy a big dose of LSD, and the patient sat there very quietly for 6 or 8 or 10 hours, and after he came down, Hoffer said, "Okay, John, what happened?" And he said, "God said to me, stop drinking," and he stopped
Wow.
drinking. So that's a specific piece of information. You can't just say, "Oh, it was all one." So I,
Right.
I think, that, there's this push to develop a universal religion, which is, based on a universal spiritual experience, which is, formless. It's generic. It's, based a
Mm,
lot on William James's ideas, from the late 1800s, early 1900s. But by doing that, you're excluding, non-universal religions, which are ones which come about through spiritual experiences, which are non-universal. They're quite specific, to the people and the place where they occur.
yes, exactly. And yeah, I've noticed this. There's a lot of like reductionism almost of looking at psychedelics like they should only be used for medicine. I think legally as well. Like if you have depression or PTSD, and that's great. That's an amazing application for it. But I feel like there's so much more multifaceted. There are other uses for them as well. Even exploring human consciousness or exploring your creativity or the divine.
Right. Well, I think that approach, that's a very fraught approach. Back in the day, there were like, bona fide academic researchers, looking at psychedelics, for alcoholism, end of life despair, heroin addiction, some for depression, but, not very much. And um, on the other hand, there were, people like, straddling, both the spiritual and academic, worlds, saying, these are transformative agents, they're going to lead to world peace. And
Mm,
on the, far end of the spectrum were folks like, Tim Leary, Ken Kesey saying, everybody must get stoned, we're going to have a revolution, um,
yes.
overthrow the government. So I think when this, generation of researchers were, kind of getting their ducks in a row, they were strategizing. What's the most, most likely way of, getting these drugs back into the mainstream, even though they had, messianic aspirations. They, wanted to, put those aspirations in the Trojan horse of medical use, safe and
Yes.
effective.
Exactly. Playing the
Uh,
game of chess.
you're playing the game, and they could not, shake the messianic impulse.
No.
Um, so even though, they tried, they just couldn't do it. So I think we're at a turning point right now. That the messianism is, being exposed, and as a result of it being exposed, there's more scrutiny and skepticism, regarding people promoting, the medical use of, psychedelics. That's not to say, that the medical use is not a, great use, but, to use, the medical use as a springboard to everybody getting, psychedelicized, that's a slippery slope.
Yeah. I would agree with you there. Because it's helped me tremendous in my earlier years, but then you get to the point where it's like I'm not sick anymore, because I feel like taking a medicine implies that I need to heal and get better, but sometimes I might have a different aspiration for it. Um,
Well, a lot of people ask me, how many times have you smoked DMT? And they, figure hundreds and hundreds. One.
one. Wow.
One. Yeah, that's all it took. Terrence McKenna, was
Yes.
at a meeting, that I was at, and I was, talking about the pineal and DMT and all this stuff. And he came up to me, he said, "Hey, you're talking about DMT, you want to try some?" So I said, "Sure." Yeah, so we, went in a room, he found some DMT, my friends were around, and it was pretty big. And my life was changed, and I dropped the melatonin work and started studying DMT instead, or, began, the 2-year process, of,
Wow.
getting things off the ground to study DMT.
How was your experience, if you don't mind sharing?
It was, completely mind-boggling. Yeah. Well, it's in, the epilogue of the DMT book, The Spirit Molecule. I disguised myself as a psychologist, and I, described, that experience. Um, yeah, like I smoked it and laid back, and there was this flaming waterfall, which appeared, like just beautiful flaming waterfall, all kinds of colors. and out of this waterfall emerged these like aliens, like 4 feet tall, like half a dozen of them from maybe 20 yards away, and they just locked onto me and said, "Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see?" I said,
What?
right. And I said, well, what the
Wow.
hell? Yeah, yeah. And I came down and thought about it, and yeah, that kind of gave me the kick in the butt that I needed back then.
Wow, and that's enough. Uh,
That was enough.
yeah. I want to actually, I'm curious to know your perspective on these, what people call autonomous DMT entities, and what do you think they are? Do you think they're just hallucinations in the brain, or archetypes from the collective unconscious, or entities from this external reality? Those seem to be the three main perspectives.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I've categorized them as like one step lower in ranking of complexity. I think
Mm,
generically you could describe them as containing information that was previously invisible. So
mm,
that captures both internally generated from your unconscious, or externally perceived from out there. So I just don't think we can really say at this point where they reside. They are perceived in the mind, for sure, but whether they're perceived or generated and perceived, as opposed to just purely perceived, we can't really tell. And I think until we uh, y- until we can tell, and even maybe uh, after determining their location, I think the more important thing is to decipher the information that they're trying to transmit. What is the meaning and the message
mm.
of what these things are trying to tell us? Is it psychological things we need to work on? Is it like a new design for fusion power? Yeah, we need to be able to extract information from the images, from the beings themselves.
Yes. Um, how much time do we have? Do I have time for
Just a
one
few
more?
more
Do you want?
minutes. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
One more question would be all right.
Okay, one more question. We'll continue another time. So, you talked about in your upcoming book, My Altered States, you mentioned about these psychological burdens, and if you have too much of them, this can get in the way of enlightenment, and psychedelics can sometimes magnify the chaos in your life. So, how do you reconcile having a good mindset going into psychedelics, with whole set and setting, you must be in a good mindset, but also using psychedelics to treat mental health problems?
Um, well, it all boils down to set and setting.
Mm,
So if you have a lot of undigested psychological problems, chances are, um, if you're just taking psychedelic on your own, or pushing through some meditative practice on your own, without supervision, support, backup, integration support, things like that, it'll be difficult. So you want to be as well prepared as you can before you go into a psychedelic state, spiritually, physically, mentally. You might think about it and decide you want to be feeling better before you decide to trip, especially if it's a experience that you're seeking for non-psychopathological reasons, like bad OCD or bad depression or substance abuse.
mm,
But if you just want to like have fun or be creative or learn to be more spiritual, you would use a smaller dose, probably, if you were at all, but you really need to get your ducks in a row. You really need to get as like as healthy as you can, at all levels, and prepare things to optimize benefit and reduce the risk of harm. um, yeah, and have safety plans uh, in store, like like on tap, you can call, you would call people, or call someone if you got in, into trouble. Yeah, you'd want to take care of things before you trip, like bills, like any,
Yeah, yeah.
kind of over, or, um, like unfinished business. If you're in a psychotherapy study, lots of that is taken care of by the treatment team. They figure out what's going on. They can assess what you want to work on, what your problems are, what kind of difficulties to expect. They're there for you if you get into a tight spot. And they're there afterwards to help you put things together, and you move forward. um, I think with the commercialization of psychedelics, people want to be able to do it in scale, like a lot of people, you know, being able to take psychedelics for their depression, let's say. And I think some of these venture pharma startup uh, entities are uh, cutting corners by reducing or by minimizing the importance of psychotherapy. And I
Mm,
think you could use small doses, and just maybe have somebody around to tell you that you're doing okay if you get into a tight corner. But I think if you really want to optimize the outcome, especially with higher doses, and minimize the harm, I think a good psychotherapeutic milieu is necessary.
mm, absolutely. Got to take care. Yeah, especially what you said about like freeing your mind with certain responsibilities that can weigh on you, you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
not having you. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. For those listening, we'll continue this conversation and go deeper down the psychedelic rabbit hole. And I would love to dive deeper into the religious aspects and Buddhism and Judaism, how that relates to psychedelics. And
Hmm.
yeah, thank you
For
so much.
sure.
I'll leave just for those listening, just again as a reminder, I'll leave a link to the book so you can pre-order on Amazon. My Altered States, really good. I love it. It's like a kind of a compilation of trip reports, but also mixing in scientific context through, interweaved with throughout this book. So I really enjoyed it. Very wild stories.
Oh, great, great. Well, yeah, that, that is good to hear. Yeah, it's like, clearly, I had, some trepidation in sharing those stories, but, stories are meant to tell, right? So just wrote them down, tried to use each one as a, teaching opportunity. Like, this is what psychedelics do. This is what alcohol does.
Yes.
This is the Oedipal complex. This is like, homosexual panic disorder. uh,
Yeah.
you, this is meditation. Yeah, so I try to step back and dispassionately discuss each of those experiences.
Yeah, it was very entertaining, and I appreciate the vulnerability because you really just open up and get very personal with a lot of these stories. So I appreciate that.
Oh, good. Well, thanks.
Awesome. Okay, I'll talk to you next time.
Okay, see you next time.
All right.